Ukraine's Air Force says that Russian forces targeted several Ukrainian cities with drone strikes overnight. And officials confirm the attacks happened just hours before the U.S. and Russia sat down for face-to-face talks on Ukraine in Riyadh, Saudi Arabia. U.S. Secretary of State Marco Rubio on the left, sitting across, there he is there, and across the table is Russia's Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov. Ukraine not at that table, and Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky says Ukraine won't accept any deal where it does not have a say.
Ukraine perceives any negotiations about Ukraine without Ukraine as those with no results. We cannot recognize anything or any agreements about us without us.
So that is some in translation of Ukraine's president. We're going to bring you a perspective in all of this from someone you met at the outset of the war between Russia and Ukraine, Russia's invasion of Ukraine, and that is very nearly 3 years to the day since that invasion began. Bohdan Nahaylo is the chief editor at the Kyiv Post. He is back with us this morning, and I'm delighted to see you again. Thank you for giving me some more time this morning.
Delighted to be with you also, Heather.
It is extraordinary, 3 years on, and here we are still talking about this, but maybe a path for peace. Let's talk about all of this. The meeting today underway in Riyadh, what we just understand from the people there, they're actually breaking for a working lunch. But what is your overall view of this meeting between the U.S. and Russia?
Well, I'm reporting from Kyiv, as you know, and here people are disgusted with the behavior of the Americans. They feel they've been stabbed in the back. And even, you've spoken about the attacks during the night. These attacks have intensified in the last few weeks. And it's as if, Russia wants to bring Ukraine down to its knees and also to show the West that it will get away with murder, literally with murder. And I think what is also very disturbing for the Ukrainians about this meeting is that the attitude that the American officials in the new administration has shown during the last week. It's not just arrogance and a patronizing one towards the Ukrainians, not to mention Canadians or people in the Gaza Strip or in Panama, but it smacks of colonialism, demanding mineral wealth from Ukraine in return, not so much for support, but for services that America will render to Ukraine in propping it up, as it were, because this is what the Americans are saying. You give away territory with no NATO for you, but we'll support you, but you give us half of the wealth that you have in your country. I mean, we haven't heard this kind of talk since the 19th century.
Exactly. It must be so stunning and so sudden for people to absorb all of this. So obviously a lot of attention to what's happening. But just to be clear, and I think you understand this too in the reporting in your paper, but this is just a sort of a preliminary discussion, is it not? Do you see it as a means to an end? Getting down, according to the Kremlin spokesperson, this is a quote, this is going to be primarily focused on restoring the entire range of U.S.-Russian relations, as well as preparing possible talks on the Ukrainian settlement. So the fact that President Zelensky is not at this table, he will be at the next one, is the understanding at this point.
No, I wouldn't assume that. Look, the Russians want to come across as peacemakers now that they've grabbed 20% of Ukraine and killed so many people and depopulated half of the country. But there is a nuance that is new. You may remember the Revolution of Dignity, the Maidan, 11 years ago. And that was triggered by Ukraine signing an association treaty with the EU. And at that point, Russia was saying no to Europe. Today, whilst this meeting is happening in Saudi Arabia, there is a subtle difference because Peskov, the Kremlin spokesman, has said today, certainly no NATO, that's out of the question in the new security arrangement. Read a Yalta type of arrangement, post-war arrangement as after World War II. But the subtle difference is EU, okay, that's for Ukraine to decide. That's the right of every sovereign country, he said today, which surprised me. I mean, so perhaps that's the hint of the compromise that the Russians might want to make, that, okay, we take what we've grabbed, no NATO, But okay, go into the EU and let the Europeans deal with you.
That's exactly right. What would the statement from the foreign ministry so far, exactly to your point, a simple refusal to accept Ukraine into NATO is not enough. They have to renounce the whole Bucharest Declaration of 2008, which said there would be a path for Ukraine into NATO. So that looks to be, from Russia's standpoint, off the table. But as you say, EU being dangled and not for Ukraine the right to territory that it's lost. These are pretty extraordinary concessions. Are you optimistic? I mean, it sounds like with EU possibility that there might be, as you say, a hint of a change. But are you optimistic that this is an avenue to peace?
Look, people are tired of the war. They've lost a lot of blood here, territory, buildings, infrastructure, but they haven't lost their pride and they haven't lost their resolve to stand their ground. I mean, how would you feel if in your country, 20% was grabbed by an aggressor and suddenly your neighbor is making up to them and saying, okay, we can live with this at the expense of the victim. Ukrainians have to be realistic. I guess their only hope right now is that Europe unites, is galvanized by the White House, the new White House. We're not blaming all Americans. America has been very generous in its support for Ukraine over the years, especially the last few years. But this attitude right now of dealing over the heads of Ukraine and of Europe and of Canada, and Canada's a NATO member, after all, it really is a game changer. And unless this sort of resentment and the opposition within Europe and within American society manages to alter the situation, we're in for dark times.
Let me ask you finally, it's so good to touch base with you on all of this. As you say, Europe not guaranteed a place at this table when talks, if they do begin. And Europe has been scrambling to find its role. There was the summit yesterday, and they couldn't agree on whether there should be some form of peacekeeping force in the future. What do you see as the place for Europe, and what are the security guarantees that are going to be necessary for Ukraine?
Look, it's quite clear that even members of Europe, Germany, for example, though we don't know how the elections will go and what changes that will bring in the next few days. But a significant number of European leaders are still not prepared to see Ukraine within NATO because of the risks that they see that this involves. I think that if Britain, France, perhaps Germany with a new government, the Scandinavian countries, the Baltic countries, Poland, if they unite, they could provide the guarantees that are needed, a certain force, boots on the ground to at least monitor the line of contact, a kind of South Korean option, but also at least close the skies, for God's sake. We've been asking for 3 years, close the skies. We don't want our missiles pouring down on our cities every night. That would be something. Open up the port, let the grain corridor at least exist and the Black Sea not become a Russian sea. That would be important. The rest, are details that can be worked out, but that at least would be something.
Bohdan, thank you so much for the time and your insight. Again, we'll be watching what happens from this seeming first phase and where it leads, and we'll be back in touch. I appreciate the conversation this morning, as always.
Thank you.
Thanks. This is CBC Morning Live.